All right, we're back again for another video lecture. We're going to talk about chapter 5 of Gatsby today. I got a lot of really good feedback from you guys that you thought that this worked really well for your schedules, that you were able to get stuff done, that you were able to watch it at your own pace and everything like that. So that's really good. I appreciate that as well. So we're going to go ahead and do another one of these for chapter 5. Hopefully it won't be quite as long as the one for chapter 3, but I make no promises because like I told you, I can just kind of talk about Gatsby. So what I'm going to do today is also incorporate some slides with text and with analysis and things like that, kind of like I did with the passages last time, but I'm going to do it like with our keynote slides. A lot of you guys said that that was one of the things that you would like to see done differently for these because it was more helpful to my visual learners as well as my auditory learners. So we're going to do both. You can follow along with the study questions. We're going to be basing a lot of the discussion that we do on those questions since you've done them. So hopefully that will help us kind of get through the chapter and make sure that we are doing everything in the order in which we need to do it and hitting all of the major points as well. So the first thing I want to do is kind of give you the basic outline for this chapter just to make sure we're all on the same page. The major events for this chapter, like Chapter 4, we talked about how we could divide it into the stories that are being told. Chapter 5, we can, in some ways, divide it into meetings, which is really interesting because we have Nick and Gatsby who meet up and kind of set up, like it's the meeting before the meeting, it's the pre-meeting. So we have Nick and Gatsby who meet, and then we have the meeting between, or the setup for the meeting between Daisy and Gatsby, and then we have the actual meeting for Daisy and Gatsby, and then we kind of have the aftermath of that meeting where Nick is like completely third wheeling it through this whole like process as they tour the house, and then we have Nick leave. So this is the chapter of meetings, which is really interesting. Last chapter, chapter 4 is the chapter of stories. This is the chapter of meetings. So to kind of set all of this up before we go into the first study question, Chapter 5 starts immediately after Chapter 4, obviously, but chronologically as well. So we have this happening immediately after Nick has just kind of found out what this favor is that Gatsby wants from him. And so he sees Gatsby outside. Gatsby is like engaging him in conversation and is like, let's go to Coney Island. Let's like go in my swimming pool. Let's do all of these things. And Nick is like, well, it's really late, so maybe not. And it says that Gatsby is just kind of waiting. He waited looking at me with suppressed eagerness. And so we know that, you know, Gatsby is awaiting this answer that Nick has. And so Nick does not leave him hanging for very long. He says, I talked with Miss Baker. I'm going to call up Daisy tomorrow and invite her over here to tea. There's this really weird, awkward interaction where Gatsby's like, well, I don't want to put you out. I don't want it to be any trouble for you. Like, what suits you? Even though it's Gatsby's favor. So what we see is that immediately after that, Gatsby tries to kind of engage Nick or give him work doing this kind of unspecified weird side hustle where Gatsby says, like, well, you could make quite a bit of money from this. Like, I know you don't make a lot of money selling bonds. You could make a lot of money doing this. And Nick says that he says, because the offer was obviously and tactlessly for a service to be rendered, I had no choice but to cut him off there. However, upon reflection, we realize, or Nick realizes, like, that this conversation might have been one of the crises of my life. And so this is another way that Fitzgerald reminds us that that Nick is telling us this in retrospect, right? Like he is coming back and reflecting on this rather than telling us the story in the present moment and kind of editorializing a little bit here. So Nick calls up Daisy, everything is agreed upon, and that brings us to our first study question and the day of the meeting. All right, so that brings us to our first study question. And it asks us specifically to chart the course of the weather in this chapter. How does it relate to the events of this chapter? So what we're looking at is kind of this timeline throughout all of these meetings that we've talked about. And so the first meeting that we deal with is when Nick and Gatsby are getting together initially. 11 o'clock, Nick tells us it's pouring rain. There's a man in a raincoat dragging a lawnmower who's tapping at his door and said that Mr. Gatsby had sent him over to cut my grass. And so this continues on through all of these preparations. Around 3:30, Nick tells us the rain cooled about 3:30 to a damp mist through which occasional thin drops swam like dew. So like things seem to be letting up, like we know that Daisy's on her way, things are going to be fine. And then around 4 o'clock, when Daisy arrives, she gets in the house. We're going to talk more about that in a moment. But it says that once more it was pouring rain. So during this meeting, Nick has to go outside because everything is so awkward. And as he's outside, it's pouring. He waits outside for about half an hour, and after half an hour, it says the sun shone again. And so when the sun comes out, it's almost like Nick sees that as this moment for him to kind of to go back in. And so when he goes back in, he tells Gatsby, he says, like, it stopped raining. And Gatsby's like, what? It stopped raining? And he repeats the news to Daisy. What do you think of that? It stopped raining. And so we see this characterization of Gatsby as like a weatherman, like an ecstatic patron of recurrent light. And we're supposed to see all the light imagery in this particular moment kind of associated with him and with like this, with the joyfulness that he has reacquired now that he is able to be with Daisy again. And so what we are supposed to be seeing is Fitzgerald is using the weather in many ways to chart Gatsby's state of mind throughout this chapter, right? Like, so the weather corresponds in many ways to his emotional state. Some of it is conscious, but once we get past this point, some of it becomes unconscious, because later in the evening, even though we've had this joyful reunion, once they get inside Gatsby's house, and this is, again, after Daisy starts to cry over the shirts, which, again, we will talk about in a moment, it says, outside Gatsby's window, it had begun to rain again, right? So we see this kind of return to this state of mind that's more unsettled and more stormy. And then the final line of the chapter is Nick, who is leaving Gatsby and Daisy together. He says, then I went out of the room and down the marble steps into the rain, leaving them there together. And so again, we're supposed to see this connection between like the emotional resonance of the scene itself and the weather that is occurring. And so we need to keep that in mind as we move forward. Pay close attention to what the weather is doing in this chapter, as Fitzgerald is also describing the events surrounding that. So that's given us a little bit of insight into the overall shape of the chapter as we discuss the weather itself. Weather is something that's going to come up again and again throughout the rest of our study of Gatsby. So definitely pay attention to any time that Fitzgerald spends time telling you what the weather is like and what it's doing, because the weather does have this kind of like cause and effect relationship upon the relationships with the characters themselves. You will see that, the emotional weather and the physical weather have a lot of connection. So now that we've had kind of that overview of like the weather and how that works throughout this chapter, let's talk a little bit more specifically about the meetings themselves. And the next thing that I want to talk about with this are the preparations that Nick and Gatsby go through as they kind of wait for Daisy to get there. The next thing we need to consider are the preparations that Gatsby and Nick make for Daisy's arrival, because they are really interesting in terms of what they say symbolically about Gatsby himself and how he views himself, and also how he views Nick. So when we're looking at this, he has Nick's lawn mowed, right? That's one of the first things. And one of the major contrasts that we see is when it says that they are looking at the lawn initially, and it says there was a sharp line where my ragged lawn ended and the darker, well-kept expanse of his began. I suspected that he meant my grass, right? So we see that kind of obsession with these outward appearances and with the appearance of wealth and the appearance of being like settled and comfortable and affluent. So the next thing that we need to look at We have Gatsby sending over flowers. It says at 2 o'clock, a greenhouse arrived from Gatsby's. And so we're looking at that hyperbole because it's not just like, oh, it's some bouquets. No, it is literally the entire greenhouse, according to Nick. And so, again, that idea of excess and abundance. Gatsby doesn't do anything ever with like half measures, it is always way over the top. Gatsby himself also dresses up. He's described as wearing a white flannel suit, a silver shirt, and a gold colored tie. And so this is all really interesting to note in terms of the color imagery with all of these preparations, because we have the green, we have, which we've talked about before, this idea of the green light, right? Now we have this green being associated with this particular meeting as well. We also have like the white, which we've talked about with Daisy and the innocence from last chapter, her white dress, her white car, the innocence of thinking that they can just be in love. And then we also have Gatsby, who is literally wearing silver and gold, right? His silver shirt, his gold tie. All of these are colors that we've seen before that have like symbolic interest in this particular text and symbolic resonances that we need to be aware of. We talked about with the green light how that is not necessarily like a simple symbol. But one of the things that we can also, conclusions that we can also draw with this, just on the surface, these are all the colors of money and wealth that we need to be aware of as well. Once we have all of these preparations that have taken place, and we have all of the flowers and the mowed lawn and Gatsby and all of his finery, Gatsby's just basically sitting in Nick's house and kind of waiting for Daisy to show up. And we can see at this point that he's becoming more and more like worked up and nervous and frankly terrified of this meeting, because this is what he's been working towards for the last 5 years, as we talked about in chapter 4, that he had bought this house, that he had followed Daisy, and so he's just waiting. He's waiting for kind of this culminating event. And so we see him with all of these descriptions of nervousness, right? He was pale. There were dark signs of sleeplessness under his eyes. It says that he is looking around with vacant eyes. He doesn't know, like he's peering through the windows as if a series of invisible but alarming happenings were taking place outside. So we can see the agitation that he's feeling and the anxiety that he's feeling as he's working up to this meeting. And before it even gets to the time for the meeting, he's like, I can't do it. He tries to leave, and he says, nobody's coming to tea. It's too late. And Nick says, it's not even time. It's still 2 minutes to 4. And so it says that he sits back down miserably, as if I had pushed him, right? So it's almost like Nick is forcing him into this meeting at this point. And then we have Daisy, who arrives. Now, only Nick goes outside to greet her. And I do want to call attention in this passage to her voice, right? It talks about the exhilarating ripple of her voice, that he has to follow the sound of her voice with his ear for a moment before he can understand the words. Again, the allure of Daisy is really characterized or brought home to us through the use of her voice. And so Nick brings her inside, or brings her in the door. We're expecting this meeting. We're expecting this moment. And Nick says, we went in. To my overwhelming surprise, the living room was deserted. And so that brings us to our third study question for this first meeting between Gatsby and Daisy. This is what he's been building up to. This is what we as the audience have been building up to. And we are delayed, right? We are not able to see it immediately because Gatsby has somehow kind of run out of the house. And so we get, like we talked about, this anxiety and this nervousness. And I want to take us through some of the ways that we see that communicated to us in the text, because they also have important resonances. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is when Nick answers the door, and it's Gatsby. Nick says, there was a light, dignified knocking at the front door. I went out and opened it. Gatsby, pale as death, with his hands plunged like weights in his coat pockets, was standing in a puddle of water, glaring tragically into my eyes. And so I want to call attention for you to this image, because this idea of like being pale as death, being, in a puddle of water. All of these images are going to come together for us. So please keep this one in mind. But again, right now it's amusing, right? Because we have this image of Gatsby kind of like soaking wet, standing, on Nick's porch when he was just in the house. And so Nick opens the door, and it says, with his hands still in his coat pockets, he stalked by me into the hall, turned sharply as if he were on a wire, and disappeared into the living room. It's like he feels like this is his duty. He must immediately get to Daisy in the living room. So, as I'm sure you are going to, realize, this is again one of the most awkward interactions that we see. Nick is like the king of the awkward interaction, or big part of the awkward interaction. So when Nick finally goes into the living room after giving them a moment to see each other, he describes Gatsby as a reclining against the mantelpiece in a strained counterfeit of perfect ease, even boredom. His head leaned so far back that it rested against the face of a defunct mantel clock. The clock took this moment to tilt dangerously at the pressure of his head. I want to call your attention to a few parts of this description. The first is this idea of like the strained counterfeit of perfect ease. So it's like this is not like he's not comfortable in any way, shape, or form. He's trying to appear so. So again, this idea of appearance versus reality that we keep coming back to with Gatsby even communicates itself to us here. I also want to point out to you this idea of the clock, right? Like this idea that Gatsby is being associated with this stopped clock. And we're going to come back to that in as we move forward. And so, speaking of time, he has this thing where he almost knocks the clock off, and it certainly does not make the encounter any more comfortable for anyone. But when they return to actually like trying to make small talk, Daisy says, "We haven't met for many years," said Daisy, her voice as matter of fact as it could be. And Gatsby immediately comes back with 5 years next November. And Nick notes the automatic quality of Gatsby's answer. So this reveals to us again, like he is attempting this nonchalance, right? He's attempting this ease and comfort. But when Daisy tries to kind of give this toss off remark, we haven't met for many years, he immediately comes back with, this is exactly how long it's been. 5 years next November. And so it shows us that he has been keeping track, and it also reminds us that this is not a casual meeting, and it reminds Daisy that this is not a casual meeting. This is not something that is, a moment of to be, kind of flippant about this and flippant about this meeting, even though they both are trying and want it to be, meaningless. It is very meaningful. Note the language that Fitzgerald uses to convey this discomfort. We have Daisy with tense, unhappy eyes. We have Gatsby who shows this immediate alarm as soon as Nick tries to leave the room. Again, wildly, he's miserable. He's incredulous. So all of these words that communicate that lack of comfort that is happening in this interaction. And so we have to ask ourselves what changes, and Nick is able to do two things. He tells Gatsby, first of all, that he's being rude, which is an insult to his hospitality, which is, an insult to Gatsby's hospitality, which is kind of a cardinal sin with Gatsby, right? Like he is the host, right? He wants everybody to be happy and comfortable. He wants everybody to have what they want. And here is Nick telling him, you're being rude, you're being a bad host. And that is really problematic for Gatsby. The second thing that Nick does is he tells Gatsby that Daisy is embarrassed, and he makes this comparison. He says, just as much as you are. And so what that does in some ways is it reminds Gatsby that Daisy is a person and is on the same level that he is, because remember, Gatsby has been idolizing her for so many years that the idea that she could have feelings, very human feelings like discomfort, and like this awkwardness, and experience that in the same way that he is, it allows him to approach her in a way that he has not been able to up until this point. And so that helps Gatsby get a hold of the situation. And so it says that Gatsby raised his hand to stop my words, looked at me with unforgettable reproach, and opening the door, cautiously went back into the other room. as Gatsby makes his way back into the living room to sit with Daisy and to have this first meeting, we see Nick go outside, right? He's trying to give them privacy, and so it says that he makes his way out the back way, just as Gatsby had when he made his nervous circuit of the house half an hour before. It says that again, the weather has changed. Once more, it's pouring, so we know that there's some sort of like emotional thing happening, like we talked about. And so Nick waits for the sun to come out, right? And so symbolically, that's really interesting, right? Because it's this idea that something has changed, and something has changed positively, right? So Nick says that while the rain continued, it had seemed like the murmur of their voices rising and swelling a little now and then with gusts of emotion. But in the new silence, I felt that silence had fallen within the house too. And so that brings us back to this scene where the rain has stopped, the sun has come out. There's this joy that's happening. And so again, I want to reiterate to you guys all of the bright imagery and the imagery of light that we see associated with Gatsby. And it says that he literally glowed without a word or gesture of exultation, and new well-being radiated from him and filled the little room. So all of those words, right? Like the glowing, the radiating, all of that imagery of brightness. And so that's something to make sure that we keep an eye on. It's also associated with Daisy and her voice, right? Like all of the brightness in Daisy's voice. They talk about the twinkle bells of sunshine in the room. And again, Fitzgerald makes this comparison of Gatsby to a weatherman, right? It's like he's brought the sun back. And so he says to Daisy, "What do you think of that? It stopped raining." And she says, "I'm glad, Jay." Her throat, full of aching, grieving beauty, told only of her unexpected joy. And so it's a way for Fitzgerald to have them talk about this mundane subject, right? Look, it stopped raining. At the same way, communicate this the reunion, and to communicate the joy that they both feel only through talking about the weather. It stopped raining. And that conversation shows us that the joy that they're taking in their reunion. The next thing that Gatsby wants, of course, now that this reunion has happened, is he wants to show Daisy his house. And so there's a lot of really interesting things that happen during this kind of house tour. And so that's what we're going to look at next. So the question asks us, why did Gatsby want Daisy to see his house, and why does Daisy weep over Gatsby's shirts? And so the first question, of course, is easy to answer, right? Gatsby wants Daisy to see his house because it is a display of his wealth and suitability. It illustrates to her and to himself that he is no longer the poor army officer in the car from last chapter. He is someone who has achieved wealth and status. And so when he's showing the house to Daisy, Fitzgerald describes it as having a feudal silhouette. Feudal as in like a feudal lord, like from the Middle Ages. And so showing his achievement of wealth and status, right? He is like the lord of the manor. And so Daisy goes through the house and looks at all of the different places. It talks about the gardens. It talks about how they wander through Marie Antoinette music rooms and restoration salons, the period bedrooms. Fitzgerald goes through and makes a list of all of the different types of rooms that they walk through, and all of the amount, right? There's a lot of listing, there's a lot of polysyndeton in that repetition of "and" that happens. This place, and this place, and this place. And so that shows, of course, like we said, this ostentatiousness, right? He wants to display his wealth and status and his suitability to Daisy. The other part of this that Nick picks up on is he says that I think he revalued everything in his house according to the measure of response it drew from her well-loved eyes. Sometimes, too, he stared around at his possessions in a dazed way, as though in her actual and astounding presence, none of it was any longer real. And so this is a really interesting commentary on the idea of his life, right? Back in chapter 3, we talked about how Owl Eyes compared his life to a house of cards, and compared his life to something that was fragile, compared his life to something that was like a set. And so it seems that in this case, like now that Daisy is here and Daisy is real, his house does become that illusion a little bit. and he's unsure of what is reality and what is illusion. And so it's interesting too, because like Fitzgerald doesn't just leave us to make that connection. He draws it for us. Nick says that as he's walking through, he says it's strange to reach the marble steps and find no stir of bright dresses in and out of the door and hear no sound but bird voices in the trees. So again, emphasizing Gatsby's isolation. But also Nick says, I felt that there were guests concealed behind every couch and table, right? That the party is actually the reality, not this isolation. And he references Owl Eyes specifically. As Gatsby closed the door of the Merton College Library, I could have sworn I heard the owl-eyed man break into ghostly laughter. And so he shows us that he really feels like that Owl Eyes would appreciate the irony of all of this, that Gatsby himself is even questioning the reality of his life and questioning, is this real? Has this actually happened? Once we get to all of the descriptions of the stuff, right, the material wealth that is in Gatsby's house, we see it kind of overwhelming, both Gatsby and Nick and Daisy finally at the end, right, when we've got the descriptions of the shirts, because we get to see Gatsby. It says he took out a pile of shirts and began throwing them one by one before us. And again, I want you guys to listen to the polysyndeton in this quote. All of these descriptions that pile on top of each other, just like the shirts pile on top of each other. Shirts of sheer linen and thick silk and fine flannel which lost their folds as they fell and covered the table in many-colored disarray. While we admired, he brought more, and the soft, rich heat mounted higher. Shirts with stripes and scrolls and plaids in coral and apple green and lavender and faint orange with monograms of Indian blue. So that overwhelming, the overwhelming and sheer volume of these shirts and what they represent is too much for Daisy. So like the luxury and the wealth of these shirts. This, along, of course, with everything else, helps Daisy to kind of come to this understanding of exactly what Gatsby has done for her, right? That he has created himself, that he has created this world, that he's created this wealth just in service of, getting back to her. And so she understands this, but at the same time, she also understands the impossibility of the relationship that she's being asked to engage in, right? She knows, just like Tom knows that he's not going to marry Myrtle, we see that Daisy in many ways is like grieving beforehand for the loss of this relationship that she's going to have with Gatsby. So there's this sense of loss that is contrasted with the imagery of plenty and the imagery of wealth and the imagery of material goods that we have here. So as we're ending, there are 3 passages that I want to draw your attention to that are all close to the end of this chapter that really speak to Gatsby's reaction to this meeting actually happening. There's a lot that goes on with this book in the discussion of the American dream, right? That whole idea of you work for what you want and then you achieve it, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, all of those things. And Gatsby really embodies that, right? Like he works for and works towards this dream, which is to acquire this wealth in order to get Daisy back. And so we're going to see kind of the outcome of all of that now that we have this achievement, right? Like this is the chapter where he achieves his dreams in many ways. So we have the first passage that I want us to look at is right after Daisy has, sat down in his bedroom and brushed her hair. And so Gatsby is overwrought, completely overwrought. And he's talking to Nick, and Nick says about Gatsby, he had passed visibly through 2 states and was entering upon a third. After his embarrassment and his unreasoning joy, he was consumed with wonder at her presence. He had been full of the idea so long, dreamed it right through to the end, waited with his teeth set, so to speak, at an inconceivable pitch of intensity. Now, in the reaction, he was running down like an overwound clock. This is the second clock imagery that we've had here, right? So this is Nick in a lot of ways describing what he's observing in Gatsby. That he's passed through this embarrassment, he's passed through this joy that we talked about, and now he is in the midst of this kind of final reaction, which again Nick describes as he's a broken clock, right? That he's running down like an overwhelmed clock. So this idea of time, right, and time that stops and time that moves and time that is broken, through the idea of clocks, keep an eye on that metaphor, because that's something that we're going to come back to. We've already seen it in this chapter, when we had the stop clock that Gatsby was leaning up against. The second passage that I want to draw your attention to is right after it starts to rain again, right after the shirt incident where Daisy has started to cry over the shirts. And so Gatsby says to her, like, if it wasn't misty, we could see your dock, right? You have a green light that burns all night at the end of your dock. And Daisy puts his arm through his, but Nick notices that Gatsby seems a little bit distracted. And this is what he says about that. He says, possibly it had occurred to him, to Gatsby, that the colossal significance of that light had now vanished forever. Compared to the great distance that had separated him from Daisy, it had seemed very near to her, almost touching her. It had seemed as close as a star to the moon. Now it was again a green light on a dock. His count of enchanted objects had diminished by one. And so what we have here is this idea of, like, he's achieved his dream, right? He's gotten the green light. He's put his hands on it. It belongs to him now. But at the same time, achieving your dream, Nick is making this comparison that achieving your dream in some ways means killing it off, right? That his count of enchanted objects had diminished by one, that it no longer has the same significance. And so we need to think about what we've seen with characters who lose their purpose and characters who no longer have, that same kind of drive to sustain them. They achieve what they've set out to do, and so what happens next? This is what we need to consider with Gatsby. The final passage that I want to look at before we're done is right before Nick leaves. This is close to the end of the chapter. Nick says that he is about to go and say goodbye. And so Nick describes again what he sees in Gatsby's face as a reaction to this meeting. He says, I saw that the expression of bewilderment had come back into Gatsby's face, as though a faint doubt had occurred to him as to the quality of his present happiness. So Nick is already noticing signs that Gatsby is like, oh, am I really happy? Is this really what I wanted? Nick goes on to say, almost 5 years. There must have been moments, even that afternoon, when Daisy tumbled short of his dreams, not through her own fault, but because of the colossal vitality of his illusion. It had gone beyond her, beyond everything. So Nick is noticing and saying, like, that there had to be moments that Daisy and this reunion didn't live up to the dream that Gatsby had put upon it, right? Or put upon this reunion. Like, the dream was better than the reality. And of course, Nick makes the point that, like, that's not Daisy's fault, because it's because of the, like, what he calls the colossal vitality of Gatsby's dream, right? This has been what he has worked towards for over 5 years. And Nick makes the point too that this dream has gone beyond even Daisy, and he says beyond even everything. And Nick finishes this passage. He says he had thrown himself into it with a creative passion, adding to it all the time, decking it out with every bright feather that drifted his way. No amount of fire or freshness can challenge what a man will store up in his ghostly heart. And so what we're looking at here, again, as we continue to talk about the idea of illusion versus reality, we have here Gatsby being confronted with the reality of his dream instead of just the illusion, the dream itself. Now it's a reality. And what do you do with that, right? Like, what does he do with that? Once he has spent so much time kind of creating this dream and working towards this dream and thinking about, like, what will happen when he actually achieves this dream. And here it is. It's in his hands. And Nick is observing that it doesn't seem to be exactly what he wanted, because, as he says, there's no amount of fire or freshness that can challenge that, right? That the illusion can never match the reality, because reality is real. People are real and human. And so again, he does make the point, again, going back to Daisy's voice, that Daisy's voice seems to be the one thing that's exempt from this. He says about Gatsby, I think that voice held him, Gatsby, most with its fluctuating, feverish warmth, because it couldn't be overdreamed. That voice was a deathless song. So that's the one thing about Daisy that seems to continue to hold that fire and freshness, that continues to kind of live up to the expectations of his dream. And again, going back to our first question, we leave Daisy and Gatsby kind of standing on the steps of her of his gigantic house, and Nick says he leaves them there in the rain, and so that's where we will end our study. I have somebody that I would like for you to meet if I can get him. Oh, nope, he's not going to let me. But you can see, there goes Mr. Fitz. He has been kind of helping out, right, through this entire lecture. You can see him there. So thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you soon. Thank you.